So the Bible is full of genealogies. They're pretty boring. Most of them are just names of people and their ages. But for the ancient people, these genealogies meant something to them. They were like time-lapse photography, and they showed family lines that continued down generations. But when a family line ended, when the genealogy stopped, so did that part of the story, which makes this single sentence so devastating. Now, Sarah was barren. She had no child. And that single line is found right in the middle of a genealogy in the book of Genesis. Now, in a culture where your legacy mattered and children were your legacy, this one line would make readers ask, well, why are we telling this story? If there's no way for this line of people to continue, why tell the story at all? Well, for the people who wrote down this story, they knew exactly how this felt. They were Jewish exiles, and they were forced from Jerusalem to Babylon about 2,500 years ago. With their temple destroyed, their land gone, and their normal life over, they were asking some questions like, is our story over too? So when they read about this childless Sarah and her husband Abram, this made sense to them. They connected with it. They felt the tension in this story. And then as they continue to read the story, the most audacious promise imaginable shows up. The storytellers tell us that God looks at this childless couple and says, I will make you a great nation. Through you, all families of the earth will be blessed. And so the promise is not just a child and not just a family, but a nation that would bless every family on earth. As incredible as that seems, what I think is most incredible about this is that Abram and Sarah believed it. These two people left everything, they stepped into the unknown based on words that defied all of the evidence. Then, after they arrived in their promised land, they built altars, and then they waited. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited. And years passed, and nothing happened. The promise went unfulfilled. Well, then we get to a point in the story where Abram broke the silence with God. And he says this to him. He says, what are you going to give me? I'm still childless. And then he says this statement, a slave in my household will be my heir. You can hear the frustration, and you can hear the doubt. You can hear the anger, the sort of anger that all of us have when we say something we know we shouldn't have said, when he shifts his anger to someone else and dehumanizes that person. I think God's response is so fascinating. God didn't get defensive. First, he quietly corrected Abram, and he called this servant a man, not a slave. And even here we begin to see a line, a thread that we find through Scripture where God refuses to accept dehumanizing language like Abram had chosen. Then the story tells us that God steps out with Abram and says, look at the stars and count them if you can count them, knowing that he can't count them. God then says, your descendants will be more than this. And so what happens here is that God is transforming Abram's doubt into an even grander vision, one that includes everyone, even the man that Abram had just dismissed. Now, for these exiles who were listening to this story and who were writing this story down, this is exactly what they needed. This story reminded them that God does make futures where futures don't seem to exist. But they also heard this story as a responsibility to live out the vision that had been given to Abram, to bless the people that they now found as their neighbors, people very different from them. Now, this story continues to be relevant for us today. Centuries later, the pastor and writer Paul connected this promise directly to Jesus. And he said this, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. Through Jesus, what Paul was saying is that the blessing that began with Abraham now extends to everyone, all nations, all people Abraham never imagined would be part of this blessing. People we can't imagine would ever be a part of the blessing. And what we discover is that faith is opening ourselves up to what God can do, not just for our sake, but for the sake of others, creating futures where futures don't seem to exist. And that's why they told this story.